talks by IU South Bend faculty on topics that may be of interest to the general public. So we're happy to see folks here who are associated with the university and also members from the broader community. That's the point of this gathering. Today we're going to hear Now You See Them, Women Screenwriters and Directors in Early Hollywood. And Dr. Roth will argue that our assumptions about the role of women in Hollywood may not be entirely accurate. I will keep the bio brief. I'm sure I could go on, but you're not here to hear about her. You're here to hear from her. So our speaker is Elaine Roth, a professor of film studies and interim chair of the English department at Indiana University South Bend. She recently held the Fulbright Garcia Robles Chair of U.S. Studies at the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City, Mexico. Co-editor of the collection Motherhood Misconceived, representing the maternal in U.S. films. She recently had a chapter on the power of sentimental cinema and sentimental politics. Ava DuVernay's Selma, and so she's analyzing that film. And it is in a collection on global sentimentality. She's currently working on a project on Patricia Highsmith's novels and diaries, and she teaches both English and film studies, and as you'll see, engages in a lot of cultural analysis.
In my class in early cinema, history of the motion picture, Kaina, in 2006, gave a presentation, got interested enough to research her project further, after which she submitted it to the website. The next thing I knew, she'd been published there. It was so great. So I had admired Jane Gaines from afar for decades, and Kaina actually contributed to the project. She's since researched and written several more entries, and she also wrote a whole book on the film Get Out. So my project has primarily been focused on white women screenwriters, but Kaina's been very interested in black women and directors and producers like Maria Williams and also Tressie Souders. I think in part her interest is because they are so under-researched. It's just a wealth of material there waiting to be discovered. All right, so shout out for Kaina. Meanwhile, in keeping with Jane Gaines' reclamation of women in early silent cinema, several film historians, Maggie Hennefeld, Laura Horak, and Ela Frungen, I'm going to say Kanaki, they put together a DVD collection in 2023 of early silent cinema titled Nasty Women, a reference to the President Trump. This is an incredible collection featuring African-American actresses and women actresses engaged in any manner of things, running, swimming, doing archery, destroying things, very disruptive, very active legacy. I was able to include a couple of these films in my film history class this past fall, really added to our understanding of early cinema, and that's what was playing beforehand. So I thought I would focus on a few case studies and then examine how it happened that women were edged out of the industry. So in the spring of and actually, so here's a few great stuff from the Nasty Women collection. They're cowboys, so here's Rowdy Ann. Here's a woman apprehending robbers. Here are women playing pool. I mean, you can just see there's just such great material here. Here is Leontine. We watched a whole film with Leontine beforehand. She is so bad. She is like Pippi Longstocking, except she's doing it on purpose. Because I feel like Pippi Longstocking gets in trouble, but you feel sympathetic for her. It's not really her fault. It's totally Leontine's fault. She's just like destroying things. Here she's putting dirt into a perfume applicator, so when people come in and put on perfume, now they're covered in dirt. She's gotten into this house by climbing up the wall. Anyway, she's just a very active, incorrigible young actress. Nobody knows who the actress was. She's actually French. This is a slight departure just because she's such a great figure. So she's French. I asked my colleague Anne Magnon Park, she had never heard of this figure, and she made 1 million movies, again, all with this active, incorrigible young character. All right. So here, in 2015, I went to the Margaret Herrick Archives at the Academy of Motion Pictures Sciences in Los Angeles. This was a fascinating experience. For one thing, you couldn't take pictures of anything and you couldn't bring your computer. They gave us a little golf pencil that we had to write everything on. Oh my God. I was there with an undergraduate who just about had a meltdown because I think young people don't write long form anymore, right? So he was really flummoxed about how to proceed. But in any case, it was a great experience. And one of the figures I researched was Jean Gantier. So she worked in the industry early on. She is credited with establishing the screenplay as we know it, and she was an actress in the girl spy adventure films. So she really fits the account of a woman screenwriter and director who seems to have been banished after much early success. She literally burst into the scene in 1907 by jumping off a cliff into a lake. That was her first stunt as a girl spy. And then she goes on to star in a series of girl spy adventure films. She was a central figure at the Kalem Film Manufacturing Company, participated in all the activity that studio took on, writing, acting, directing, although she claims that she disliked directing. Her career, though, ended as precipitously as it began. She left Kalem to form her own company, the Jane Gantier Feature Players Company, which lasted only 2 years. Jane Gaines has noted that there were at least 60 woman-owned film production companies in the silent era, and so probably the field got oversaturated, is what happened. So she comes back, goes to Universal, and in 1915, she writes a really sad letter. Let's see what we see. Yeah, here, let's look at the happy stuff first. Here she is as the girl spy between writing, directing, acting, and producing. There was lots of job doubling. Women had served as directors for decades, but once that task and title became distinguished, that job became gendered and associated with power. And associated with power and also giving orders to other people, right? And so that's one way that women got edged out. Another is that thanks to the professionalization of the workforce, an 8-to-5 schedule was adopted, and this is specific for the women screenwriters, a lot of whom had been writing from home. And suddenly they needed to be on the lot from 8 to 5. Finance capital also had a big change in 1925, and that affected filmmaking. And there are other reasons. This is speculative, but I think sort of the myth of the talented genius that circulates in Hollywood, it's really prevalent in the industry, kept women screenwriters and directors isolated and vulnerable to dismissal, rather than a collective identity of women writers who might have been able to protect themselves and each other. In addition, and sort of in keeping with this, phenomenon that the surrounding the industry focused on women screenwriters and directors as a phenomenon, neglecting a clear historical lineage, avoiding depicting them as the establishment, but instead as a novelty. So Karen Ward Marr notes that in 1927, Dorothy Arzner was heralded as Paramount's first woman director, despite the fact that Lois Weber had directed multiple films for Paramount in 1920. And I found this in my own research. Every new announcement would be of a new woman screenwriter, a new woman head of production, despite the fact that there had been many in the previous decade. Historians of the era, such as April Miller, have commented on this, suggesting that several women directors seem not even to know about each other, right? And this comes back to Jane Gaines' point, I think, about really it was ephemeral even at the time. Then Jane Gaines goes on to make this other interesting point, which is that 1970s feminism, she thinks, underestimated women's early history. And she thinks it might be about a possible anxiety that basically that claim in the 1970s was about having been left out. We have been left out, right? And that having said, like, actually we used to own this place, was not as useful a rhetorical strategy, right? And so that's one reason that was not part of 1970s feminist rhetoric, including feminist film studies rhetoric. Instead, early women film critics were very interested in Freudian and psychoanalytical interpretations of cinema, and that goes on throughout the second half of the 20th century. It's not until the 21st century that they turn to the archives and to history and rediscover this history. And Jane Gaines notes just how satisfying it is to discover this physical daredevilry and economic savvy. It's a real antidote to that 70s sort of notion of erasure and victimization. All right, here is Karen Ward Marr's book, Women Filmmakers in Early Hollywood. She details the way that the national rise of professionalism in the 1920s resulted in displacing women directors. And she points out that this has, of course, continued into the 21st century. She's got a good caveat, though. She says, there was no memo circulated to studio heads asking them to eliminate women filmmakers in the 1920s. Rather, a shift in ideology brought gender roles within the film industry in line with those of other industries. And she noted that screenwriting nonetheless continued to be available to women throughout the 1920s. So I now want to turn to two case studies that lead me to my current thesis. The first is Anita Loos. And I chose Anita Loos initially because she is an outlier. She was born in the 19th century, wrote for movies throughout the silent era, worked with D.W. Griffith, but then continued writing for the film industry throughout the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. She wrote for television in the 1950s. She's probably best known for writing Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. So she was an exceptional case, and I thought I would compare her to other women in the industry. Like Agnes Christine Johnson, who was working at the same time. But instead, I realized that the women actually shared remarkably similar careers. They were born around the same time, they died around the same time, both began writing very early, both earned incredibly high salaries, salaries that were so high that they were commented on in the newspapers. They both continued writing for film and television into the 1940s and the 1950s. So my first discovery is that some of the original screenwriters, like Anita Loos and Agnes Christine Johnson, had not been banished at all. They had written for cinema into the sound era and then into television before they retired in their mid-60s. Plus, they were super wealthy. And after retiring from Hollywood, they continued to write memoirs and advice columns. So, focus a little bit on Anita Loos. She wrote her entire life from her early years. She sent story ideas to D.W. Griffith's Biograph Company. Then she wrote multiple memoirs when she had retired. Between 1912 and 1915, when she was actually in her early 20s, although she called herself a teenager because she was very, very slight, she claims that she wrote 105 screenplays, all but 4 of which were produced. She's been credited as being perhaps the first paid screenwriter hired at Biograph by Griffith for salary. She helped launch Douglas Fairbanks to fame. That's him on her right and her husband on her left. Witnessed many moments in film history, but she herself just gamely persisted. First she wrote one-page scenarios, then she wrote subtitles, then she fixed silent films she hadn't written. She and her husband, there on her left, leave Hollywood, write for Broadway. She continues to write there. She writes for Harper's Bazaar. Those short pieces get turned into the novel Gentlemen Prefer Blondes in 1925. That becomes a bestseller. She adapts that for the stage. She goes back to Hollywood. She adapts it for Hollywood in 1928, and then in 1953, of course. Oh, and here is her cute little pixie haircut. Here's Gentlemen Prefer Blondes with Marilyn Monroe. She worked alongside her husband for many years, but her career lasted much longer than his. One of the reasons, it's interesting to think about why her career was sustained, right? One was she's just wildly productive. Another key to her success might have been her ability to intersect with the celebrity and glamour of the industry, so that she was literally never invisible, even as a writer behind the scenes. Instead, she fostered this trademark look, this pixie haircut. She was immediately identifiable. She had this haircut her entire life. She socialized with stars and other prominent members of the industry. So that's one speculation about her success. All right, Agnes Christine Johnson, as it turned out, had kind of a similar career. So that's Agnes Christine Johnson in black. In the middle is Marion Davies, who you guys might recall. She's the actress who's depicted in Citizen Kane. So she was a girlfriend of Hearst. So she similarly, Agnes Christine Johnson, began writing very early for the film industry, sold her first screenplay in 1914 when she was only 18 years old, went on to enjoy a long success as a writer. Her career began right after she sold her first screenplay, lasted for almost 35 years. She began to write exclusively for Mary Pickford. She was an incredibly well-paid screenwriter, and I will note that in 1925, her weekly salary was the same as Irving Thalberg's, who was head of production, and roughly what a tenured faculty member in the humanities makes at my institution today, without accounting for inflation. In 1929, she was paid as much as $10,000 for a motion picture photoplay, which is what they were called, for First National Studios. Like Anita Loos, she first retired from Hollywood in the 20s, but she comes back and eventually returns to MGM and writes screenplays into the 1950s, and then she writes for television. She writes for the Andy Hardy series. She wrote for Harold Lloyd. She and her husband, similarly to Anita Loos, worked and collaborated together for many years. Her husband wrote an article called "Why I Am Glad My Wife Works for Her Living." And unlike Anita Loos, who never had any children, they had 3 kids as well. Similarly to Anita Loos, and this again might be key to her success, she courted the press, she was a celebrity figure herself, she was one of Hollywood's social trendsetters, she rode in celebrity steeplechase and polo matches, she hosted popular ping pong parties, and traveled around Paris with her newborn son in a handbasket, which I have not gotten any photos of, but would love to see. So again, just a few ideas about which women screenwriters prevailed and which didn't, because as I kept investigating them, they kept not being banished, right? Jean Gontier fit that model, but these others didn't. So first of all, it's noteworthy that women who got divorced suffered. So Alice Guy Blaché, the French filmmaker who comes over to the United States, her husband leaves her, and her career is over, his career goes on. Both Marion Davies and Mary Pickford saw their careers decline post-divorce, whereas both Agnes Christine Johnston and Anita Loos were notable in that their marriages lasted for a really long time. You know, this is unusual Hollywood then and now. Before meeting her first husband, and again, this might be key to their success, Anita Loos and Christine Johnson. Anita Loos married early, and she characterized very cravenly in order to gain the social mobility available to a single woman. She immediately left him, but did not divorce him, using her status as a married woman as protection and credential in social and professional circles. Her second marriage, particularly in its last decades, her husband actually becomes institutionalized because of alcoholism. So he's institutionalized for decades while her career goes on. So her second marriage may have similarly functioned, granting her access to male arenas. And Juliana Muschio also noted that many of the most successful, by which I mean sort of with longevity, women screenwriters retain their maiden names after marriage. That's true of both Loos and Johnson. So I also want to take a moment here to note that even while women were no longer on the literal site of Hollywood in the 1940s and 1950s, female novelists nonetheless continued to provide source material for the movies, although their role remained similarly obscure. So if male screenwriters dominated the industry from the 1930s on, women wrote the original source material for many films, including Hitchcock films, dark film noirs, as well as melodramas. So some of these writers are well known, like I think we've heard of Daphne du Maurier, who wrote Rebecca, that was directed by Hitchcock. I think by now we have heard of Patricia Highsmith, who wrote Strangers on a Train. At the time, she was not very well known. The films are considered classics. So for instance, Laura was written by Vera Caspary. Imitation of Life was written by Fannie Hurst and then adapted into films in the 1930s and the 1950s. So the stars are famous, like Lana Turner is in the 1959 Imitation of Life, but it's worth noting that the women authors play no role in our understanding of Hollywood, despite their major contribution. It's also worth noting here that writers of both sexes are typically neglected. Male screenwriters and novelists rarely receive much credit either. I thought I'd turn here also to Elizabeth Sanksay Holding. She's a useful example of a mid-century woman novelist who managed to get one book adapted for film over the course of a long career. She wrote 24 novels. Raymond Chandler said of her, "For my money, she's the top suspense writer of them all." Alfred Hitchcock selected her book, The Blank Wall, as one of 20 in his anthology, My Favorites in Suspense. This is the novel for which she's probably best known because it gets adapted into 2 films, The Reckless Moment in 1949, and then also The Deep End in 2001. But her career in Hollywood was a vexed one. So even after the success of The Reckless Moment, none of her other work is ever made into a film. Instead, I found a typed letter about her at the archives written by her own representative, Harold Ober, which includes a handwritten addendum, and I brought this one as well in case we want to read it and weep. So this one says, confidentially, she was a lot more trouble than she was worth. She was always in debt, always borrowing money, and I let her go because I figured she was losing me money. And indeed, like many women writers, she would have been writing for money. That's one of the reasons that she would have approached Hollywood. And there were, of course, there would have also been other motivating factors like ambition and a quest for fame, or at least a legacy. So, back to my argument. I had begun my investigation kind of naively hoping that I might be able to identify how women were banished from the industry. I was looking for a smoking gun. or a memo. And I thought maybe their paychecks were reduced, or maybe their access to the studios was compromised. So when I went to the archives, I thought I would study contracts to see what the contracts for male screenwriters looked like compared to the contracts for women screenwriters. However, there were few contracts to be found, and the ones that were in the archives were much more casual than I had expected. Nobody had signed them. They weren't like routine or standard, it turned out. Finally, and this is how these things happen, on literally my last day in the archives, one of the librarians said, what about instead of the contracts, you look at the payroll? And the payroll, this was incredible. So this was this huge leather book written in elegant cursive. Every week, the pay that every person associated with the studio received, from the candy person to the screenwriters to the directors. It was a genius suggestion. I only had like a couple of hours, but I spent my final hours in the archives looking at beautifully handwritten weekly payrolls for the major silent film studios, which clearly demonstrated that women screenwriters made as much or more than their male colleagues. So in terms of the disappearance of women from the industry, there was no smoking gun. Instead, you know, as the way ideology works, it was much more subtle. So rather than being banished, what may have happened, at least if we consider the careers of Anita Luce and Agnes Christine Johnston, so here's my argument, is that no successive generation of women screenwriters were allowed to fill their places, either when they left to go to the theater or after they permanently retired in the 1950s. So their longevity reveals that women were in fact hired by Hollywood in the 1940s and 1950s, but perhaps only if they were known quantities. And by then, most of them were women who had had really dynamic careers, right? And many of the other women had retired. In the meantime, the field had changed. There was no room for the next crop of younger women eager to go into the field. So the door sort of went shut slowly, and everyone who wasn't already in was locked out. That's my working thesis. So despite the wealth of material that has become available about women during the silent era, my central question of how the women screenwriters get edged out has not been adequately answered. And so I will to continue to work on it. And my argument is basically, they weren't fired, they just weren't replaced. And if this turns out to be a thesis that I can support, it would lend itself then to a kind of rousing cry for more mentorship in Hollywood today, right? Like maybe that's the avenue. Because as a profound additional loss, along with their jobs, the lasting legacy of these early women screenwriters also disappeared. Meanwhile, back in the 21st century, the Academy of Motion Pictures has been working to respond to campaigns like Oscars So White and the Me Too movement. In 2016, it doubled its incoming class and invited a greater number of women and people of color. It continued this direction. This is from Vanity Fair in 2020, an article about the new representation in the Academy. This recognition of the value of women and people of color in the industry dovetails with the work of film scholars to uncover the historical contributions of these communities. And I would only hope that perhaps by seeking a legacy for the largely forgotten women of the silent film industry, the work of film historians to uncover Hollywood's more diverse history can help shape not only Hollywood's past, but also its future. Thanks.
Okay, we have time for questions.
Elaine, do you envision someone giving a talk in 50 years at Pop-Up University saying, whatever happened to tenured professors? They weren't fired, they just weren't replaced.
Let's at least not go gently. Let's not leave an ephemeral history.
Yeah, I guess I do have a real question. Not that that one's not real, but the part about the title seemed pretty interesting to me, because I can, not knowing anything about the start of it, but I can imagine like getting together and saying, hey, let's make a film.
Exactly.
And nobody's a director and nobody's an actor, and they just do it. And so, was that the way it started?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And a lot of people think that's really key to how they got edged out, because it's a group of people collaborating. They're behind the camera, they're in front of the camera, someone's calling the shot. In the end, it's a collaborative, it's all co-produced. And then thanks to that professionalization in the 1920s, as soon as those jobs start being given titles and assigned a particular role, the particular role assigned to the director is bossing everyone else around and getting credit for the film. And so that's going to go to the men and not to the women. And so you can just see that happen thanks to that professionalization in the 1920s. I think that's really true. My question, though, is that's just not quite as true for writing, right? Like, why the screenwriter couldn't still be a woman in the 1930s and the 1940s is still a mystery to me.
But interestingly enough, on the poster that you showed for Some Like It Hot or Gentlemen,
Yeah, I'm so glad you noticed that.
There wasn't any reference to Anita Lou's
No.
poster. And
No.
she not only wrote it, but she screen wrote it.
Yeah. Right, and you know, that's pretty typical that writers tend not to get that credit, but you're right, I'm so glad you noticed that. None of the film posters include their names. Yeah, you're exactly right. Henry?
Are you aware, have you looked for any analogous trajectories in other industries where early on when they were not profitable, women had prominent roles and then were edged out or not replaced as they became more profitable?
Yeah, it's a great question. Today I started wondering about the circus, right? Because I was thinking about this idea of films cropping up first in this sort of carnivalesque atmosphere at the county fair or at the circus. But it's not my sense or impression that circuses were ever had good representation from women, right? I don't think of them as being run by women. And so I don't have an analogy. It's a great question, I think. Like, are there other phenomenon where this is something that happens in the 1920s? And then I'm also really interested in other countries, like how this played out in other countries. I really was interested in the Mexico question and also what happened in Germany as well. Like I said, when I proposed my Fulbright in Mexico, I was saying there are all of these women directors and actresses in Mexico at the time. One of them founds Azteca Cinema, which is still their #1 television station in Mexico. But the panelists were just like, we're interested in the class you're teaching right now. And I was like, fine, I'll come for any project. But one of the women on the panel actually at the end of the interview said, you should keep with that project. So I hope to. I mean, it'd be very interesting. Each national industry is having a different national moment, right? And so how does it happen in other places? But also other career tracks. That's a great question.
But yeah, to Henry, it's like theater or vaudeville or something like
Right.
that. Similar,
Yeah.
but not quite the same. I wonder if there were trajectories like that.
Right. Yeah, Elizabeth.
Can you talk a little bit more about your thinking about the role of the marriages of these two figures where they're going to have some cover by being, I'm married, but I'm going to keep my name, but also as much as possible live like a single person and get all those advantages while being married? Like what you think the dynamic is there and why that was so useful?
Right, that's super fascinating. So here's Anita Luce with her husband, and she's very, very, not unlike actually the Marilyn Monroe character in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. She's really direct in her memoirs. And so she says explicitly that she was a teenager, a man that she didn't love, immediately left town so that she could go to Hollywood as a married woman, right, and not be taken advantage of. Then she does eventually divorce him and she marries, this is John Emerson, her husband. And he, to his credit, he's an excellent partner to her. He is a huge promoter of her and is making sure in the early years that she's getting credit. He really celebrates her in any number of ways. Then they collaborate together really productively. And then his health fails and she sort of continues relentlessly for the rest of her career. All the while, as you pointed out, drawing upon, I think, the and power of a woman in heterosexual marriage during that time, right? So, so it's interesting. I mean, that I think was a really successful match. She does seem to have liked him. But I also think it served her really well. Unlike, again, like Alice Guy Blaché comes from France. She's a secretary working for the Lumière, so this is a whole other story, but Alice Guy Blaché is a secretary working for the Lumiere brothers in France in 1895, goes to see their first projection of the motion pictures and says, that's what I'm going to do. Quits her job as a secretary, starts making movies, founds her own film company, comes to the United States, founds a film company there, and her husband runs off with a dancer, and that's it for her. Like, she doesn't have any kind of social wherewithal, and her career is really over. Meanwhile, Agnes Christine Johnston, again, that seemed like a really successful match and relationship. He similarly promoted her, wrote about her in that article, "It's so great that my wife has a job." She made more money than he did, and he was totally okay with this, as he explained in the article. They moved a lot. In fact, there are a whole other research project is that for 7 years they go down and are living in Guadalajara, Mexico, and I'm just fascinated to know what they're doing there, and do they connect with the Mexican film industry in Mexico City during that time. She doesn't write as many memoirs as Anita Luce does, so it's a little harder to track her. Otherwise, I'm not sure why she's not as famous as Anita Luce. I guess Gentlemen Prefer Blondes is a really lasting cultural legacy. And Agnes Christine Johnston doesn't quite luck into that. In any case, all this to say, the protection of heterosexuality, I think, was central and crucial to their success. And they were really lucky to have supportive partners as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think World War II has anything to do with this?
Yeah, so that's huge.
Or the Depression?
Right.
Or go back further to the Great Depression.
Yeah.
That once the Great Depression clicks in, basically they were under tremendous, sorry, overall, taking over here. I just wonder if this is, Hollywood was under tremendous pressure to hire men. They were basically saying we have to hire men to keep the breadwinners of many families.
Yeah, that's interesting. That is when she leaves, they leave and go to Broadway during the Depression, but then they come back.
They come back, but,
yeah, and it's very
but that's
successful when they
unusual
come back.
though.
I think it is, although Agnes Christine Johnston does it also. They also leave to bring things to Broadway during the Depression, to your point, I think, and then are back within just a couple of years, and then work in Hollywood for the next 30 years.
Huh.
Yeah. But I do think the Depression is going to play a role. World War II is definitely going to play a role. By the time World War II begins, the women are gone. And so it's not one of those things where, like, women become machinists or women go to the factory. Women do not go back to Hollywood during World War II. Yeah, for whatever reason. Yeah. Yeah, great.
Do you think that the substance of the films created by women played a role in why they were excluded too? Like, in the same way that maybe people of color were excluded for more like revolutionary and aesthetically challenging things that challenged the status quo, that when the cinema industry became more streamlined and industrialized, kind of took over from that. Do you think that like those substances of like maybe more surrealist cinema that was a very large part women that kind of died out when it became more mainstream, that have an effect?
Yeah, I think that's a great reading, a great interpretation. I think that's definitely true. And again, I don't think there's like a one-to-one smoking gun, but you can certainly see that the content was different, right? We can go back to the women being spies and cowboys and arresting people, and yeah, Girl Spy. The first Hollywood film that ever addresses the question of abortion is directed by a woman. We showed before it began a terrific short film called Laughing Gas, where an African American woman gets laughing gas, and then according to the logic of the film, she's laughing hysterically, and so she goes into public spaces. This is all in 1907, and her laughter disrupts the room, but nobody's mad at her. Instead, they all laugh with her. It's contagious. She goes onto the train, and everybody laughs. She goes to the police station, she gets arrested, and everybody laughs. And so it's super revolutionary, and just turning power on its head. And so I think that that's absolutely the case. And we see that movies, you know, when you think about sort of also the rise of the production code, movies in the 1930s and the 1940s are really going to follow a much more conventional conservative narrative line.
And especially with some modern movies that I think have been stigmatized, that have very strong underlying tones of revolutionary spirit. Like a good example, like American Psycho, a very feminist film that has been very stigmatized for maybe contributing to male violence while very openly criticizing it. Do you think the like, because of the change in cinema to the more patriarchal aesthetics, kind of people forgot like what film was about, you know, or
Yeah, and I think there's some hope. Christine Vachon, who produced that film, was just at the Academy Awards, so she's still making films that have these visionary goals. And I just read that Ryan Coogler he's going to finance his own film, which is about vampires fighting the Ku Klux Klan, which has got a lot of potential, right? And so that's sort of one trajectory, right? So Ryan Coogler writes an independent film, that gets him great success. He launches into Black Panther, he's hugely successful there, and now he's got the capital and resources to make the movie that he wants to make. So that's a very interesting thing that could play out in the 21st century that might kind of echo the earlier century than before. Yeah, Jeff.
I wondered if you could comment on, I think, point number 9 on how did it happen?
Yeah.
That it was basically, it didn't help the 70s feminists to make their argument. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and this was less how women got pushed out of the workforce and more how that history also got lost, right? So that basically Jane Gaines was saying, why weren't film studies critics, feminist film studies critics in the 1970s seeing what had happened fairly recently in that moment, right? But instead, that sort of narrative of 1970s feminism was, we have been victimized, right? And we need to fight back against this victimization. Instead,
what are your thoughts on that? Does that hold water to you?
I can't quite tell. I mean, I like Jane Gaines. It's an interesting speculation. I mean, it is true that women film critics do not turn to the archives until 2005, right? Like, nobody notices this lost history for whatever reason. Instead, the prevailing interpretive framework is psychoanalysis, and so that's what I was trained in. That's what we all came up in graduate school in the 90s. Nobody was doing historical research in the industry, so it doesn't not make sense because I don't not buy it, right? It lands a little uneasily, right? You don't want to blame the victims, but it is an interesting perspective and framework, I think. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Where does Mary Pickford play in all this? Because I think of her history as being involved with like the creation of a studio. And then she kind of disappears as well. So what is Mary Pickford's role? 20s, talkies, 30s?
Right. Yeah, so she's also, her career sort of follows this classic trajectory. Maybe to come back to Elizabeth's point, also, I think another reason that Anita Luce was so unthreatening was because she did present as being very small. She did not take up any space. She was just sort of like an ingenue gamine. So similarly, Mary Pickford makes a long career of playing children. She plays girls for a long time, and during that time she becomes hugely successful. She makes a really successful career partnership, and they found a studio like lots of other people do, but then they get divorced. And as soon as that happens, her career is over, and by then she's too old to play the child role that got her that part, and she never transitions into playing like a matriarch role, and so it all sort of ends for her very abruptly. But again, it is kind of about the demise of that relationship. But she was another woman in Hollywood with a massive amount of power and, star power in her case. Yeah, great.
So I'm not a film critic. I actually don't watch many movies at all. I'm excited to be here though.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
I was wondering, I noticed that most of the movies accredited to Anita Luce and Christine Johnson are centered around romance. Is that a staple for the time, or would you attribute that to the fact that they could really only get published and produced what appeals to the male patriarchal gaze?
So this is a great question, and this would be a great archival initiative, because I think what we are looking at is only what has survived. They made hundreds of movies, and most of these are lost, although they keep cropping up places. Like someone in Los Angeles will pass away and it will be discovered in their garage. They've got all of these movies, literally. Or Oscar Michaud's film showed up in South America, in Argentina, and they had to retranslate all of the intertitles from Spanish back to the original English. So these early films are showing up. Mind you, they're in bad shape because they're made with that celluloid nitrate, which is super unstable and has been sort of corroding in everyone's garages. But to your question, we would need to look at their body of work. And I think my guess would be that what remains is what fits that narrative. I think they made a broad range of things. When you go back, it's remarkable, the sort of genre and different eclectic productions, kind of coming back to your point about the richness of that source material. But I think that things that get seized upon and preserved and trotted out as representing their careers are going to accord to a more conventional type. So it would be fascinating to try to find the body, the entire body of one of these filmmakers' work, right? And then really see what she did, what she made. That would be a great project, I think. Yeah.
Just a little bit of a curiosity. The woman you spoke of, that where you have the letter that just says no, compared to your two case studies, right? This is someone who did fail, right? And didn't have that longevity of your case studies. I was just, this is just a curiosity of like, I think you implied that the letter, so correct me, that the letter was a way, they're trying to get their career back?
Yeah.
Like come back in?
Yeah.
What were they asking for? Or I just wondering if you knew, like I know you've read the letter, can you get like one?
She just wanted a part. I mean, it's super pitiful, right? I do think the Women Film Pioneer says, we don't really know what happens. We don't know why she gets banished. I looked through a lot of stuff in the archives, and it did actually look to me like she made an inauspicious, took up an inauspicious relationship. So she filmed the first film filmed overseas in Ireland, so it's an Irish production, and she takes up with an Irish actor there and tries to bring him back to Hollywood, and that's a disaster. And they become sort of a toxic couple, and no one will touch them, and then that means that she's back sort of begging later just to get a single part. And so I'm not exactly sure that's what happened, but it really lines up when you look at the source material.
Maybe there's more confidential memos of just like, oh, she's horrible to work with, like your other letter you mentioned. But
yeah, it's true. I think he was the problem, actually. So I think he's sort of, unfortunately, a sort of classic stereotype. And he's sort of problematic on the set. Yeah.
But the fact that the women who divorced were then did not continue on, was there a morality issue, perhaps? I mean, the divorcee kind of.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah, and then just not having access to that, like, clearly coded male power, I think. Suddenly then they would just be a single woman in the 1920s or the 1930s. Yeah.
Besides spouses and friends, was anybody or any organization championing women writers and directors, a particular studio or organized labor, or even actors?
Yeah. Kevin, this is so good. So that is not there, right? And so Agnes Christine Johnson, when she comes back, she starts to lobby. So she's the one that does end up with a long career, but in the 1920s, she starts to lobby for women to at least know who, like, get together, right? She starts to argue for this. And I don't know what comes of it. It sort of does not get much traction, but that's definitely her idea. And she does end up with a long career, but she is working to try to put together at least kind of networks. Yeah, and I was also thinking it would be interesting to track this phenomenon alongside the rise of labor unions in the industry.
Right.
Yeah.
Did that ever cross over the camera lens into the actors? You know, the Gene
Right.
Kelly's, Lana Turner's,
Right.
Did they ever support female writers and directors overtly themselves?
Yeah, Mary Pickford did. She liked working with Frances Marion, and she also liked working with Agnes Christine Johnson. Sometimes you would be sort of attached to a particular star that you would trust, who could write to your persona. Yeah. Yeah, but yeah, again, the connection to labor unions, I think, would be a really productive one. Yeah.
So, Elaine, it seems like Hollywood loves nothing better than to make movies about making movies. Do any of these nuances you're tracking ever get teased out in some later Hollywood history of its wonderful self?
So this is a nice question. Damien Chazelle, so he did First Man, but he's known most for La La Land. he just did a movie called Babylon, and I was so excited about it because it's about film production during the silent era. And he was promising that it was going to really show the rambunctious nature. So in my opinion, I think he leaned in a little too much to the rambunctious nature of it all. So everybody is having an orgy, nobody has any clothes on, everyone is screaming obscenities on the film set. It's kind of hard to imagine that this could reflect in any way the lived reality of people who were churning out hundreds of movies a year. They just had to be more professional than that, right? So it's too bad that that's the first foray, but maybe it opens the door to something that will reflect a little bit more sort of what was happening during the time. I see Elizabeth percolating. Oh yeah, Lisa.
So when I think about 1970s historians looking back at the earlier era, I think sometimes they're critical of that the women in that period before World War I didn't go far enough and accepted many aspects of traditional gender roles. So I'm wondering about this previous question of the kind of the content of the films that were produced, and I'm wondering if that is one of the dynamics, is that if the films, if at least some of what has remained, emphasize kind of romance and traditional women's roles, that maybe that would be one of the reasons why the women, the historians of the 1970s or the activists of the 1970s might have not looked back to those early screenwriters as being like their pioneers. And
yeah, that's a really nice point, Lisa, and I would think that it would be both the content of the material, but also the industry practices that they might have been reacting to. Like I bet, or I would speculate that they would have wanted a sort of champion as opposed to someone who collaborated with her husband for many years, right? And so I wonder if that was also part of the lack of connection with those early industries in which women in long skirts were working with their husbands and making movies about domesticity, right? If that would not have been attractive to them in that moment, right? Yeah, I think that's a nice point.
But the girl spy, come on.
I know, what's not to like?
All right, last chance for questions. Great questions, great answers. Thank you so
questions.
much.